Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the last live stream for about 10 days because I'm heading off to Poland and Germany next week to do some browsing of sites. But today I'm talking to my friend Jon Parshall about how the events of mid-1942 affected British and American ambitions and plans and the role of Admiral King in that planning. And I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon, Jon. How are you today?
I am delightful. So nice to see you again.
Good. So you've got a bit of news to kind of relay to people, haven't you? That
I
you
do,
couldn't
and
kind of
I'll
say
get
last time.
I'll get to that on slide number 2. So
Okay, we'll do that. So we were just talking about the world of being a historian and stepping out of your comfort zone and you know no matter how many years I do this, the more each day passes, the more I realize how little I know and how complicated it all is, and also how everything connects to everything else. As Indy
yes,
Nidell says, nothing happens in a vacuum. And we've
yes,
talked about it before, and I've talked about it with John McManus, and you've talked about it with Seth and the others. A shit lot of stuff is happening in 1942, both negative and positive for
right.
everybody, for Axis and allies. Obviously that is the focus of is it the quote unquote best year of the war in terms of study?
I think well, obviously I'm incredibly biased, right? But yeah, I think so. I just because I really feel that during that year everything really is kind of in play.
Yeah,
It's the first year where all the big dogs are in.
yeah.
And now, we got to get it sorted. Who's going to come out on top on this thing? So, yeah, from my standpoint, and some of that obviously stemmed just naturally from the fact that I've been doing Midway now for 20 freaking years. But, there's there's for a guy who's written a very large book on the Battle of Midway, you become aware of the fact that Midway in and of itself is still this very small event in this much larger
Yeah.
scheme of what's going on across the world. And that was the reason that I undertook, my second book project, which has lasted for 16 years, was to educate myself around the larger structure of that year, 1942.
Well, I was just reminding myself today, preparing for this, I've been talking a lot about how much was happening in August, September, and October 1944. We've done Arnhem and the Scheldt,
Yeah.
but a lot is happening. Sort of May to sort of September 42, the Eastern Front, the Mediterranean. It's building up to what's going to become the
Yep.
final battle in North Africa. The Soviet Stalingrad is hotting
Yep.
up. The Atlantic War is kind of in the middle of its key moment there, and then there's the Pacific, and then there's still in the UK building of forces. There's
Yep.
production orders going in via governments left, right, and center. Training programs are churning out pilots and navigators the world over.
Yep.
It's a hell of a lot of
It's a
stuff
hell
happening.
of a
But
lot. Yeah.
anyway, we'll bring
Yeah.
up your PowerPoint slides, folks,
There we
and
are.
this is going to be John's going to do a presentation as such, but there'll be lots of sort of sprawling, random rabbit holes we'll go into as we go along
Which
the
is
way.
what we do. Yeah, that's what we live for. So, yeah, what I want to talk to folks about today is just this 2-month time period from the end of the Battle of Midway to the beginning of the Guadalcanal campaign. So, June to August of 1942, which not only changed dramatically what ends up happening in the Pacific War, but I think has important knock on effects towards Anglo-American global strategy as well. And so I want to kind of talk about how all that comes about. But before that, just sort of alluding to a shameless plug here.
We
For the
like
last,
shameless plugs.
absolutely, for the last 16 years, I have been working on a new book, which title is 1942 Crux of War, basically looking at how the Allies turned around their train wrecks during this year and went from dumpster fire for the first 6 months to within the last 40 days, starting in late October, you've got Alamein, Torch, Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, and then, of course, the beginning of the Stalingrad counteroffensive. That 40-day time period when the armored pincers meet at Kalak, behind Sixth Army, that really, in many ways, is the most disastrous time period for the Axis.
Yeah.
Up until you get to the middle of 1944, when you've got D-Day, Bagration, Battle of Philippine Sea, and the whole Marianas offensive. so the question then becomes, how did all this happen? How did all that coalesce then at the end of 1942? And there's a lot of stuff going on under the hood, and that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at the whole war.
Cool.
So I'm really pleased to announce that just in the last week or so, I have agreed to a term sheet from Oxford University Press to publish this book in early 2026. I'm going to be working with the great Timothy Bent, who has edited 9 books for my buddy Craig Simons. He's edited a couple for Ian Ona Johnson, who you probably know as well.
I know him.
Yep. So Timothy is the best in the business, and he's really excited about this project and has definitely made it clear that he looks at some of the things that I think are central, such as really big, beautiful maps, of which there are 140 in this book. He's like, yeah, we got to have a sufficient trim size to show all that stuff off. So I'm just thrilled to be working with Tim and with Oxford. I think it's the best possible place for this book. So I would encourage anybody who's potentially interested in learning more about it, please do visit my book site at 1942book.com. Sign up for the mailing list. I promise not to spam you, but I will give you occasional updates on what's coming down the pike as we move this book.
You had me at 140 maps, John.
Attaboy. I love maps, and the maps are, I hate to say it, don't want to brag, but the maps are great. So, and you've read chunks of this manuscript yourself,
yeah,
Paul.
no, incredible stuff. And I'm not just saying that because you're a mate. It was incredible stuff. When it started changing my perception, and I go, hang on, I didn't know that. That's a really good point. And yet it's sort of, there was a comfortable sweater feeling about stuff I read about that I had read about before, but in that kind of new angle. But anyway, let's not.
Yeah.
Cool. People say, get a room, you two. So we'll carry on.
That's right. Very good. All right. On to the show. So what I want to talk about, again, is this 2-month time period in the Pacific. And so just quick refresher course on the Battle of Midway for those of you who may not know. The battle itself took place from 4 to 7 June 1942. And for our purposes, really the most important proximate effect that comes out of that is just the change in the balance of carrier forces within the Pacific. So if we look at what I call the carrier scorecard right before the Battle of Midway, you can see that the Americans have got 6 big flight decks, but they've just lost the Lexington at the Battle of Coral Sea. Her sister Saratoga is in the shop because she keeps running across enemy submarines and getting torpedoed. We've got the 3 Yorktown-class carriers in the Pacific, but the Wasp is still out in the Atlantic doing things like running Spitfires over to Malta and that kind of thing. Meanwhile, on the Japanese side, they've got now 5 big flight decks because they've just commissioned the converted carrier Junyo. Shokaku and Zuikaku are kind of out of combat in the aftermath of the Battle of Coral Sea. Shokaku because it's been physically damaged, Zuikaku because its air group got shot to pieces. They've also just lost the smaller carrier Shoho, but they got these 4 other smaller carriers as well. But the takeaway here is the Japanese seriously outnumber the Americans when it comes to number of operational flight decks. But when we look now at the aftermath of Midway, ouch. The Japanese have lost their 4 best aircraft carriers in the course of a single day. We only lose Yorktown in return. And so now we have managed to sort of claw our way back to a state of parity in big flight decks here in the Pacific. And parity doesn't sound very exciting, but parity in the dark days of 1942 was incredibly, wonderfully awesome because it allows the Americans to kind of get out of this defensive crouch that they've been in for the last 6 months and start contemplating, how do we want this war to go? Where do we want to start thinking about counterattacking, grabbing the initiative, and so forth? And so that's going to be a series of discussions that's going to kick off almost immediately. And the real driver here is Admiral Ernest King, who is Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Navy. Obviously, Chester Nimitz, who's Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, is also an important player. And then there's this gentleman, Douglas MacArthur, who is the theater commander down in the Southwest Pacific area, currently headquartered in Australia. One of the documents that I like using as sort of a flashlight to get into the heads of some of these decision makers is what's called it's the running intelligence estimate and summary that was kept by Pacific Fleet in Hawaii. In the trade, we call this the Gray Book, and it's thousands and thousands and thousands of pages long, but it contains all of the message traffic that is going back and forth between King and Nimitz and Gormley down in the, in Southwest Pacific and that sort of thing, South Pacific, I should say. So this is a really good document for being able to drill in, what were people thinking at any given day and time. So you can see here's an excerpt from the Gray Book on 10 June. So this is just 3 days after the Battle of Midway is concluded. And this is a message from Com Inch to Sink Pack. That is to say, Admiral King to his subordinate, Nimitz. And King here is summing up what he thinks the Japanese next moves will be, trying to estimate what those future moves are. And you'll see in the highlight down here that he thinks the first thing that's going to happen once they've gotten their act together back in home waters is that they're going to assemble their available forces to move against South or Southwest Pacific before our sea forces can be shifted there. And knowing King, of course, he's going to try to preempt that if at all possible. So let's do a little map exercise here. Just want to, kind of walk through the situation in the South and Southwest Pacific. This is a depiction of what the Japanese Empire looks like at the end of the Battle of Midway. And if we drill down a little bit, you can also see the supply line that's running down from Hawaii down towards Australia. And all those little blue dots there are the garrisons that we plunked down willy-nilly in the first few months of this conflict to try to guarantee the safety of that particular supply line. So if we then zoom into the area of New Britain, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands, by about February of 1942, the Japanese have occupied New Britain and New Ireland, and they've established an important base at Rabaul. That's going to be their linchpin for all of their offensive activities down in this neck of the woods. And you can see the line of the Solomons, marching down to the southeast and heading towards that supply line, which is off the map down in the lower right corner. And if we zoom in then on Guadalcanal and Tulagi in particular, there's no Japanese presence here until the Battle of Coral Sea in early May of 1942. But on 5th May, the Japanese bring a force down here and they occupy the small island of Tulagi, which was the British provincial capital, and start building a seaplane base there. And then on 8 June, just 2 days after, actually the day after the end of Midway, our coast watchers get wind of the fact that there's some Japanese transports sitting off Lunga Point, landing troops of some sort and starting to do something around Lunga. And there's a great deal of grass being burnt off and whatnot, but it takes us a fairly long time to finally figure out. But on 6th July, it becomes clear to those coast watchers that the Japanese are in fact building an airfield here. And this is very bad news for the Allies, because if that airfield goes into commission, that means that now all of the Solomons will be under Japan's air umbrella. And that in turn means that that supply line now is in direct danger, because the Japanese are now poised to push further to the southeast, go into places like the New Hebrides, maybe New Caledonia, maybe Fiji, something like that, which would be directly astride this supply line. And as my buddy Rich Frank says, that supply line is essentially the Allies' sciatic nerve in the Pacific. And anytime there's a threat to it, we react very, very vigorously. And that's exactly what's going to happen here. So meanwhile, back on 20th June, here's a staff assessment that we find in the Gray Book from Nimitz's staff. And they're talking about the fact that consideration is being given to taking the offense in the Southwest Pacific. Because of the Coral Sea and Midway battles, the time may be here to at least start retaking positions in the New Britain, New Guinea area. It is interesting to note that this question is also being aired over the radio and in the press today. Source, General MacArthur, which obviously, if you're a Navy guy, you want MacArthur in the driver's seat of Pacific strategy, like you want a hole in the head. And so this too is going to lend a certain degree of urgency, I guess I would say, to the Navy deliberations. Just 2 days afterwards, again, Nimitz's staff is saying that what we're going to do is we're going to sail 2 carrier task forces down to the Coral Sea area about 3 July. In other words, just in a week or so. And the goal, once they get there, is to contend further Jap advances in the Southwest Pacific and be in a position to cover and support amphibious operations such as the recapture of Tulagi. This is the first time that we see in the American primary sources the mention of the word Tulagi. And again, this is taking place just 2 weeks after the Battle of Midway has ended. 2 days later, 24 June, Cominch to SINCPAC, King makes it official that what we're going to do as the first order of business when we get down there is we are going to seize an initial occupation of Tulagi and adjacent islands. Guadalcanal is not even mentioned by name. It's Tulagi on the card at this point, but that adjacent island, and understand too that at this point in time we do not yet have confirmation that the Japanese are building that airfield on Guadalcanal. That's not going to come out for another 2 weeks or so, but the objective is already being sort of widened away from just Tulagi itself. There's a problem, though, in that King has not vetted any of this with his counterparts on the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff. And that means that I don't know the exact date that this happens, but sometime toward the end of June, King walks into one of these weekly meetings at the Joint Chiefs and just basically announces, I've cut orders to, use my Marine division and I'm going to go recapture Tulagi, which is kind of not cool to be doing things in a unilateral fashion. And this irks General Marshall because, among other things, General Marshall has got his own problems in that he's having to ride herd over a very restive subordinate in the personage of Douglas MacArthur. Mm. So, thank you, Ernie, for making my life that much more complex. And one of the real problems here is that if you look at the command areas within the Pacific at this point in time, you'll notice that the dividing line between the South Pacific area, which is under Nimitz's control, and the Southwest Pacific area, which is MacArthur, literally goes through the middle of Guadalcanal. That line plunks down just a little bit to the west of Lunga Point. And so MacArthur's kind of got a legitimate beef here, in that at least half of this island and the vast bulk of the Solomons are within his command area. What the heck? What's going on? And so he loses it and gets very, very angry, thinks, starts calling out that this is all a perfidious Navy plot, to take over strategy making in the Pacific, et cetera, et cetera. And, as far as Ernie King is concerned, I don't really care because in King's mind, this is a naval war. The only division that is capable of undertaking an amphibious offensive at this point is my 1st Marine Division. That division is going to have to be supported by naval ships and supplied by naval ships. This is our operation, and he's absolutely obdurate that he will not put it underneath the command of MacArthur. Which,
just a quick question for you, John. Yeah. The eminent Canadian historian David O'Keefe is saying, so what idiots drew the map? I mean, why does the line fall through there? Was it
That's a beautiful question. You know what? I look at that and I'm just like, what idiots drew the maps in Africa, right? I mean, just a bunch of stupid people. It's like, I don't know the exact meridian. I think it's like 140 degrees. I honestly don't know, but I'm sure that it was just this completely arbitrary,
But it's amazing how many times that seemed to affect things. I mean, it happened in the Falaise Gap with it, the occurring between sectors. It's happened, I'm sure it happened on the Eastern Front somewhere, didn't it? Where it felt it's just often an arbitrary decision made, but it ends up having these diplomatic,
huge
strategic impacts later on down the line.
Right. And I should say to David, that's a guess on my part. That would be my strong guess, but I have not delved into the minutia of why that line did get drawn there. But that's a great question. So
Thanks.
the bottom line is that this leaves Marshall then in the position of having to play peacemaker between the Army and the Navy, which is a role, of course, that he is going to be reprising over and over as this war continues to roll on. But what ends up happening is that Marshall says, okay, look, we're going to let the Navy run this first operation. And actually, this all folds into a series of strategic discussions, which are going to become known as Cartwheel, that eventually the main goal is going to be, we're going to cut off, surround, and eventually invade Rabaul and get rid of that bastion. But that's going to be a multi-part operation. So what we're going to say is the Navy's going to run part one of this thing, which is Operation Watchtower, which is going to be the invasion of Tulagi and eventually Guadalcanal. Other phases in Cartwheel, however, will fall under MacArthur's command. So that's sort of the compromise that gets hammered out here. And one of the things that they do then is they go back to that map and they shove MacArthur's command area over by 1 degree, so that now Guadalcanal is completely within the Navy's purview. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, nothing like a little gerrymandering to keep an operation rolling. The next complication, though, comes about in the Americans trying to sell this operation to the combined chiefs of staff, in other words, their counterparts in Britain. And as it happens, there is an upcoming staff meeting that's going to be happening here in the middle of July in London. And this then rolls directly into the whole notion of Germany first, which has been the agreed upon strategic direction between both the Americans and the British, that Germany is by far the most dangerous of our three Axis opponents. And so what we're going to do is we're going to stand on the defensive in the Pacific, and we're going to beat on Germany, put it out of business first, and then and only then will we turn and face the Japanese and start, getting rid of the Japanese Empire. That at least has been the lip service that everybody on all of the combined chiefs has been, paying lip service to since the beginning of this war. The other piece of backdrop, of course, is that Marshall very much wants to invade France this year. Yeah. And this is the reason for him going over to that meeting in London, is to try to persuade the British chiefs that this is a great idea and we should go ahead and invade Northern Europe sometime in the fall here. So that leads to this meeting where we've got Marshall and King to get dispatched over to Britain. They're going to face up to their opposite numbers, Alan Brooke, Dudley Pound, Charles Portal, and try to hammer out some sort of an agreement as to what our strategy is going to be for the remainder of the year. There's a monkey wrench, though, in that FDR has told King and Marshall, you must come home with a deal that has American troops in combat against German troops this year. For domestic political reasons, I had got to be able to show the American people that this war is moving ahead and that we are, directly aiding our Soviet allies and we are killing Germans. I don't care where that happens, but it's got to happen. And so, basically, he is now hamstringing both King and Marshall because he kind of knows this, but as long as the British hold tight, they're in a much better bargaining position than King and Marshall are. You've got to come home with a deal for me. And so off he sends them to London. And there's at least some indication that these requirements of FDR's may in fact have been leaked to the British so that the British understood that King and Marshall had to come back with a deal, which means that when we kick off this meeting on 20th July, Marshall basically comes right out and says, we want to invade Europe this year. And the British are like, no, we are not going to we've been kicked out of the European continent 3 times already. Thank you very much. And we don't think that your army knows its business at this point. You've never fought the Germans, and we bloody well have. And, we're just not going to do this thing. And so the result then is that the British know that all they have to do is just hold the line. We can just sit here until you guys finally give up. And that's exactly what happens over the next 3 days. It's just the series of circular nowheresville conversations that go around and around and around, with Alan Brooks staring out the window and breaking pencils occasionally, and the Americans becoming more and more frustrated, until finally, on the 23rd of July, the British basically say, well, we could go to North Africa. They're not all that thrilled about it. This is kind of Churchill's pet idea, but they feel better about going into North Africa than they do about invading Europe, that's for sure. And it would certainly then meet the president's directives that we be in direct combat with the Germans, because we got plenty of Germans in North Africa we're trying to get rid of. And so what basically ends up happening then is Marshall folds, because he has to, and says, okay, fine, we're going to do what's going to be torch. And the real winner from this whole thing, beyond just the British are the clear winners of this particular conference, but Ernie King is a winner too, and nobody really realizes it at the time, because buried in the paperwork and the memos that come out of this conference, there's a recognition that, we, the Americans, we're going to be sending over about 800 aircraft that would have taken part as tactical air support for that potential invasion. We ain't going to be using them in Europe this year. We're going to send them to the Pacific instead. And so now King has in hand not only a document that says that you can wage war in the Pacific, but here are some forces to do it. He's kind of upset the strategic apple cart, and the British don't really recognize the full extent of that quite yet. Meanwhile, back in the Pacific, 2 July, another set of orders from King to both Nimitz and his man Gormley down in the South Pacific area, with a CC to MacArthur, that offensive operations will be conducted with the ultimate objective of seizure and occupation of New Britain and New Ireland, New Guinea area. The first task, however, is to seize and occupy Santa Cruz Islands, Tulagi, and adjacent positions. And just 40 minutes later, he says that, by the way, the target date for kicking this thing off is tentatively set as August 1st, 1942, i.e. less than a month away. And anybody who knows anything about the Guadalcanal campaign, the sort of the inside joke name for that operation was Operation Shoestring, because it was just being completely thrown together. We got this Marine division that's a division in name only, because its regiments are scattered all over hell and gone, and they've had no training, and everything is just a complete rush job. And in the event, it turns out that no, we can't possibly land forces in on August 1st, but we do manage to get them by 7 August. And that kicks off the Guadalcanal campaign. And in the course of that campaign, which is going to run until February of 1942, there are going to be about a half a dozen major naval battles that go down during that time. There is going to be a series of increasingly bloody land combats that are going to culminate in late October of that year as well. There's a constant drumbeat of aerial combat overhead as the Japanese are sending bombers down from Rabaul to try to put Henderson Field out of business. So this becomes, a very major set to. And if you take a look at the losses at the end of this campaign, they are dramatic. The Americans and the Japanese both will lose about 24 major warships. The Japanese, 3,500 sailors, between 700 and 900 aircraft, and 1,200 to 1,900 aviators. Again, if you really want to talk about bloody noses for the Japanese, that scale of aviator losses makes battles like Midway just pale in comparison. Importantly, too, 25,000 plus soldiers are going to die on Guadalcanal, most of them due to starvation and disease, meaning Japan is going to walk out of this thing with about 30,000 fatalities. The Americans and their allies are going to walk out with about 7,100 fatalities. And you'll notice here that for all of the press that the Marines get, that this is their battle and they were the ones suffering in the jungles and whatnot, which is true, and I don't want to demean that, but the U.S. Navy pays 3 for 1 in terms of body bags to hold on to this island. And we're going to lose a lot of sailors here in the course of securing this place. But the net result is that the Japanese are handed a dramatic defeat. We have now taken the initiative away from them. The Americans will always be on the offensive for the remainder of the Pacific War. So I think if you look at King's accomplishments within this 2-month time period, they are significant. First of all, he's ripped the guts out of Japan's carrier force, which is no mean, accomplishment in and of itself. Again, being in a position of parity is beautiful for us because, of course, long term, given our building programs, we're going to be in a much better position to prosecute this war, and everybody knows it. So being able to drag ourselves back up to parity meant that we were able to initiate counteroffensive activities much sooner than we would have been able to otherwise. So that's accomplishment number one. He then very quickly takes that accomplishment, turns around, and initiates what is going to be, I say, the decisive campaign of the entire Pacific War. Yes, you can fast forward ahead and you can look at the Marianas Campaign combined with the Battle of Philippine Sea, and you can say that that is pretty devastating to Japanese military capabilities. But by the middle of 1944, the trajectory of this war has long since been decided, and it has not been decided in the middle of 1942. So for my money, the Guadalcanal campaign is more important than the Marianas Campaign, just again for the knock-on effects that we have throughout the remainder of the war. One of which is that it gets the attritional machinery for this war up and running months sooner than it would have otherwise. And those of you who know me know that one of my pet phrases is the sausage grinder, that there's this huge need for the Americans to establish a sausage grinder in this war, in that the only way the Americans are going to win this war is to move their military forces somewhere proximate to the Japanese home islands. That's going to turn out to be the Marianas, where we can either bomb the home islands into ruin or blockade the home islands into collapse and or physically invade them. And it may be all three. We don't know.
I was going to say all of them, yeah.
All of the above, right. And the only way to make that happen, though, is to start grinding Japan's military to pieces and inflicting the attritional mode of warfare on them that we need in order to be able to position ourselves to do that long term. So the sooner that sausage grinder gets set up, and I don't even really care where it gets set up, I just got to get that machinery running so that every day I roll out of bed knowing it's going to be a great day today because we are going to be killing Japanese soldiers, shooting down their aircraft, and hopefully getting into naval battles on a fairly frequent basis. We don't have that sausage grinder up until the Guadalcanal campaign. And the fact that we could get that machinery up and running, 6 months, maybe a year earlier than we would have otherwise, that's a huge benefit in terms of the long-term trajectory of the war. And most intriguingly, I think, is the King has fundamentally reoriented Allied global grand strategy. He came into that July meeting saying it was Germany first. He leaves that meeting, and it's Germany mostly first, and it's going to be that way for the rest of the war. King has to be given credit for being months ahead of his contemporaries in understanding not only would the United States have the industrial and military moxie this year to wage a multi-front war, but also that given the unanticipated scale of the initial Japanese onslaught, that we cannot afford to stand passively on the defensive in this theater and wait until we're done with Germany before we start whittling away at Japanese conquest. If we don't get going on this thing, we're not going to get to Tokyo until the 1950s. That's unacceptable. So we absolutely have to get the Pacific War underway, and we're going to have sufficient resources to fight it. And like I say, if you look at this year at least, I would argue that King really is the architect of everything that happens in the Pacific that is good for the Allies this year. And as a result, puts us in a position to terminate the war months earlier than we would have otherwise. So that's, he may not have been the most likable guy, but he was, at least in terms of the Pacific War, absolutely a strategic colossus, really. He is the driver in this theater that gives us what it is that we want. So there you have it.
Wow.
Boom.
Fantastic stuff. And I've got a lot of things whirling through my head to ask, and we've got questions from the viewers as well. Let's do some of the viewer ones first. So relating to what you just said about kind of taking American forces closer to Japan, David O'Keefe has said, do you attrit to maneuver or maneuver to attrit? Which is a nice way of putting it, David.
That's a great question. Next question, please. No. That's a really good question. That one catches me. I would say that within the early context of the Pacific War, what I see is, really broadly speaking, a maneuver-based strategy.
Right.
That what you're seeing from King is his ability to take emerging possibilities and then go to very unexpected locales to wage his war. Understand that when King makes the decision that I'm going to go fight down in the South Pacific, he is throwing out 25 years worth of interwar doctrine that was all, War Plan Orange. We're supposed to grind across the Central Pacific and he's like, no, we ain't doing that. We're going to go down and fight in this place that half of my officers couldn't find on a map 6 months ago. And it's an awful locale to do battle in, among other things, because our logistical, nightmares down there are just going to be perverse. But again, in order to preserve that supply line running down to Australia, which we view as an absolutely non-negotiable launching pad for future operations aimed against the Southern Resource Area, I got to hold on to that place. And so one of the things that I admire about King and also Nimitz too is their flexibility of thought. That I don't think that if you had sat down with King at the beginning of this war and say, how's this thing going to go, he couldn't have told you any of this stuff was going to happen. But again, he was very quick to seize emergent possibilities and was far less concerned about coming up with doctrinaire answers. And in that sense was then willing to maneuver into the South Pacific to set up that sausage grinder. I guess, thank you for giving me a great question that made me think on my feet. But yeah, I'm saying maneuver to attrit.
Yeah, and Big D said, I would argue that strategically you attrit to maneuver, tactically you maneuver to attrit. So that's another mouthful. And David O'Keefe has followed up with, John is definitely going on my people to have lunch with list. So
I would love
make that happen, because I love spending time with David. We've not yet met John, but we can make that happen.
Yeah, and I'm not that far from Canada too. I just want to point that out. I'm in Minnesota, right? Come on down. So, anyway,
Admiral King. So I'm not a naval historian, but I think most people watching is the two things they can name about Admiral King are the Germany first thing, which we're going to address, but I want to come back to that, and the fact he doesn't like the Brits, which
that's not true.
Which there's an element of kind of, he does say some, he's a bit prickly, but it's basically bollocks, isn't it? I mean,
he doesn't like Dudley. He doesn't like Dudley Pound, is what he doesn't like.
Yeah.
Okay. He doesn't. The thing about King is that he is enormously capable. He's held every goddamn position in the U.S. Navy there is to handle, and he's better at them than pretty much anybody else that he knows, and he knows it. I mean, I'm not saying he's not a difficult guy, but he's also enormously capable. So one of the vignettes that gets pointed out by, there's a Canadian historian, a guy named Ken Hansen, who talks a little bit about King's reaction to Paukenschlag during the first part of the war. And I think he says some sort of illuminating things that before the war happened, when King is running the Atlantic Fleet, he has made a series of suggestions to Dudley Pound about ways in which we could reconfigure the escort routes that would be more fuel efficient and efficient in terms of escort usage and that kind of stuff. But it would have meant that in some cases, British task forces would come under American tactical control. And Pound is like, no way, I'm not doing that. And I'm not saying that King would not have had similarly prickly reactions had the hats been reversed. But the bottom line is that from a logistical standpoint, King's suggestions were sound. And when Pound rejects them, he's dead to King, because King no longer respects him. And once you've lost King's respect, he's just like, I don't want to deal with you. So I don't see a violent Anglophobe in Ernest King so much as I see someone who is enormously capable and also very pro-U.S. Navy. That's really his thing. You know, you're not going to tell me how I'm going to operate what is going to be the world's largest combat fleet and how I'm going to employ them. Screw you. That's kind of King's thing.
Yeah, that's a fair point. But we've got more questions coming in. But
Yeah.
this Germany first thing, because we talked a lot earlier in the year about, well, not you and I, but other people, about sometimes Eisenhower's directives being a bit vague, and Montgomery can be guilty of vague directives. And Germany first, if you ask people just watching this what that means, some people would assume that means you completely defeat Germany without touching the Pacific at all, and then when you defeated Germany, you then move the Pacific, which clearly is not what it's meant to mean. But it's more like it being kind of first on a nominal list, but not that the Pacific is not still on the list. It's just that it's secondary on the list. And I think that that whole Germany first thing has been a bit of a red herring, really, in analyzing the war. It's kind of a good hook, but it's oversimplifying what actually was going on.
Although my pushback to that is that I wish I had the direct quote. You know, I'm looking over at my manuscript here, seeing if I can find it. But one of here, hold on. We're going to do some real-time history here because I think it's a great quote. Damn. Basically, Dill comes back. John Dill, who's the Brits representative in Washington D.C. For the Joint Chiefs. When the Joint Chiefs are not actually physically together, there's an entire British mission in Washington D.C. and John Dill does yeoman's work keeping that organization running. After that meeting in July, Dill says to Marshall that it seems that, you know, some of your planners no longer are really treating Germany first as the Bible. And Marshall basically says that's because it's kind of not. You know, you can't have your diplomatic cake and eat it too. I mean, if you took my invasion off the table for this year, we've got other resources and we're going to go use them where we think they will do the most good. And so I gave those aircraft to King, and we both know where that's going to go. And Marshall, too, Marshall doesn't have a problem with the Guadalcanal operation per se, because he is looking at it through the lens of the Chinese, that if we can create a manpower and military sump for the Japanese in the Solomons that takes the heat off of the Chinese, it keeps the Chinese in the war, and by extension then makes it very difficult for the Japanese to contemplate further offensive activities aimed in Manchuria that might discomfit the Russians, because we're incredibly concerned about what's happening in the USSR at this time, which is one of those sort of fascinating kind of, you know, you got all these interconnection points that are multi-theater in scope, and that we tend to forget in 80 years hindsight, but China and the Soviet Union do play into all of this as well.
Well, I think that's worth mentioning, because Sean Brennan asked about, you know, you mentioned the War Plan Orange, allies are useful but complicated things. War Plan Orange didn't require protecting supplies to Australia. And of course, when War Plan Orange was conceived, as indeed plans by the Japanese in the 30s and the Brits, everybody else, is no one could have envisaged the complicated diplomatic, political, geopolitical situation that's going on in 1942. I mean, even the Mediterranean alone is complicated. Which way is Turkey going to go? What's going on over there? What's happening? And then you add all that together with Australia's, and the Dutch are involved in it as well. To balance all that into, it would have been impossible to predict that in any kind of 1930s setting.
And so I'd say that one of the reasons we're so sensitive too regarding the supply line to Australia is there's a pair of American divisions down in Australia at this point, because as the wheels were coming off the British Empire and Malaya and then Burma, the Australians are like, the Japanese are going to be on our doorstep pretty soon. And we know the mother country cannot help us. We're screwed without the Americans. And so John Curtin, the prime minister in Australia, makes this, there was a newspaper article that says, without reference or, fear of prior connections to the mother country, we now look to America to be our guarantor of security, if you will, which must have been like, when Winston Churchill read that, a spear through his heart, But the British were in no position to guarantee Australian safety at this point. They had nothing. And so the result is that the Americans broker a deal where they say, okay, look, Australia, if you will keep your 9th AIF division in the Mideast to help out Montgomery, we will send 2 of our divisions over to Australia to guarantee your security. And that means that now those supply lines are protecting American boys as well. There's no way in hell we're going to let those things go down the tubes. I wanted to go way back to a comment that was made when we were talking about those July meetings. Somebody barked out that the notion of not invading Germany during 42, that the British were correct. I'm like, hell yeah, they were. I just very much want to raise my hand on that one and say that, I'm totally in Alan Brooks' camp on that. There's no way until the U.S. Army has been blooded and understands what it is doing. Because everybody's first encounters with the Wehrmacht are unpleasant, right? And and as Rick Atkinson said in his book, North Africa was a great place to be lousy in. France would have been a terrible place to be lousy in.
That's a massive, great rabbit hole. But the people who say that the British and Commonwealth would never have been in North Africa in the first place because it doesn't have that massive impact on the global war, and I can kind of see what they're getting at, but without it as just a big bloody great training ground, and I'm not, and that sounds like I'm dismissing the lives lost in Crusader and Compass. I'm not. I'm just saying it without, and it's not just on a large level, not just looking when we talked about artillery, how that was developed in North Africa, even simple things like the use of special forces, the use of British Parachute Regiment, the SAS, they cut their teeth in the North Africa campaign, enabling them to go on to things like Husky later on. So, yes, sure, absolutely. You don't just go to North Africa just to learn how to wage war, but it was bloody vital that the British and the Americans and Aussies and the Kiwis, everybody did learn how to wage war. And I would argue North Africa and Tunisia is where we all learned how to kick ass, basically.
I'm 100% behind that. The other thing I would point out too, that from a direct war fighting standpoint, and this gets lost in the background because nobody cares about logistics, but I do.
We all do here.
I love logistics. Clearing the Mediterranean for the usage of Allied shipping is going to save us millions of ton miles where we don't have to send ships around the Cape of Good Hope in order to get supplies into the Mideast and over to India. That's humongously important because shipping is our scarcest commodity in 1942, and it's going to remain our scarcest commodity, really, that and manpower throughout this war.
Yeah, no, just thank you. That brilliant stuff, by the way. Just to go back to King, I think the King not liking the Brits also connects with the fact that a lot of us have sort of conveniently forgotten how strained Anglo-American relations were up until after Torch, when things finally start getting better. And okay, there's still little issues in 44, there's issues in 45, but
Yeah.
you know, they're cracks, as opposed to by then the Axis that have canyons in their working
Right.
relationships. But I would say 42 up to after Casablanca is when the relationship between the Brits and Americans is at its most strained,
It's
stroke
fractious.
complicated.
Yeah, complicated. Yep. No, I think that's right. Because a large part of what the Americans have got to do this year is put together the machinery to run a war,
Yeah.
and that's a real learning exercise in and of itself. And it's clear that the British come into this war with a much better staff organization than we had. I mean, because you guys have been doing this for, better part of 3 years at this point. So that's one thing that's happening. So yeah, those we're kind of feeling each other out, trying how are we going to work together, and you've got some kind of difficult personalities in this group too. I mean, King is difficult. Alan Brooke is super difficult. Dudley Pound is
dying,
and we don't know that at the time, but he makes people crazy because he falls asleep in meetings, and he's also kind of surly. He's sort of a surly old sea dog. I mean, him and King are just not going to get along under any circumstances. And then on the Pacific, you've got MacArthur, who thinks that the Pacific that our global strategy should be Pacific first, not Germany first.
And Philippines first, and everything
Philippines
else. Yeah,
first, exactly. And so you've got all these, contentions going on there, and the relationship between Nimitz and King in the first 6 months of the war, likewise, is extremely tenuous. King looks at Nimitz as a paper pusher, thinks he's just he's an HR guy. He ran the personnel department. Who is this guy? He's not a war fighter. King calls him a fixer, which is not a term of endearment. And so it really takes a while before King, really up until about April, before King gets a sense for, actually, this dude is pretty aggressive. He wants to go down and fight a carrier battle with all our carriers down in the Coral Sea. That's pretty ballsy. So, yeah, I think it's really not going to be until after Casablanca, probably. It's earlier in the Pacific. By the time we get done with Midway, and certainly by the midpoint in Guadalcanal campaign, King understands Nimitz is a playa. I can rely on this guy. He's sufficiently aggressive for my tastes. I've got competent management here. This is all good. But yeah, you're right that the Americans and the British are still kind of circling each other, and trying to throw together this invasion. Torch is just so incredibly ambitious when you think about it. That just, again, an operation being thrown together because we don't even get
it's written on the back of a cigarette packet in a pub, isn't it? Almost.
It's crazy when you think
what's
about
intelligence? We don't know. Where are we going? What's the climate like?
What's the objective?
We don't know. We'll find out when we get there. Yeah.
Eisenhower says as much when he's doing the planning for it. It's like, all I know is I'm going to Africa to do something.
Yeah.
So,
but this is so important, this era, to get through this era. Now, going back to what we said right at the beginning of how important 1942 was, and I'm glad you name checked John Deal earlier as well, because Alan Allport, I think, was the one who kind of reminded me that when you look at these, not just the big conferences, the Casablancas and the Yaltas, but these meetings of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, whatever, is that you can kind of see it go British win, and then later American win, But Casablanca, is that the last one the Brits kind of win in terms of going into? I don't know.
That's how we Americans look at it.
Yeah, I mean, it should be a conference should be about compromise and conversation and projections, and everybody's got their PowerPoint presentation to do. But
yeah,
you do see this. Oh, the Brits won that one, and later on, the Americans start winning more over the Brits based on the fact you've got more toys to play with in some ways.
That's well, and it's fascinating too, because that July 1942 conference is going to have fascinating downstream implications.
Yeah,
Marshall loses, right, and he's not happy about it. But to all outward appearances, he's cool as a cucumber. He's completely civil. He is easy to work with. but he remembers.
Mm.
And, when we get to 1944 and the British are still hesitating about whether or not we're going to do a cross-channel invasion or not, completely different game at this point.
Yeah.
And Marshall is now willing to use the power that he has ruthlessly to get what it is that he wants. And he's got the other chiefs on board with him, including Admiral Leahy, who understand. I mean, Leahy is one of these guys who really flies under the radar. Nobody really knows who that dude is. But he is FDR's vizier. He is absolutely simpatico with the president of the United States on all things strategic. So when Leahy comes into the room, he is essentially channeling FDR's desires and wishes. And there are episodes where Leahy is getting up in the grill of the British and like, you're going to get on board. It's not negotiable anymore because, we have way more toys than you do, as you say. And anyway, so
at least the British and Americans are able to have the dialogue. I mean, this is the thing: is if we're comparing this to the Axis don't even gather around the table. Essentially, the Japanese and the Germans really have almost no contact whatsoever. Thankfully, because if they start, hang on, if we do this at the same time you're doing that, this might have an effect. They're not doing that. Crucially,
they never do that.
Almost working against each other, let alone working for each other.
In 42, there were opportunities maybe to do that sort of thing. I mean, the thing that Allenbrook feared the most, of course, was some sort of a German offensive through the Caucasus that would come down into the Middle East, and the Japanese coming out of, first taking India and then, coming into the Mideast that way. There are a whole bunch of logistical problems with making that happen, but really, too, there are problems of timing in that the Japanese are sort of hitting their high water mark around April, May, but there was no way that there was going to be any ability to do a Russian offensive through the Caucasus until you get through the muddy season, and that ain't happening until late June. And so not only did they not have any sort of planning body or any sort of grand strategic directive organization, there were just mismatches in geography and timing that made direct cooperation really, really difficult.
Well, rather than it just being you and I hogging the conversation, or rather my hogging it with my questions, we've got a whole build-up of questions in the sidebar. Some will be quick, some will be longer. So Ian T is saying, how did King get on with Cunningham?
I don't know. That's a great question.
If you don't know, it probably means it was okay then, wasn't it?
I think so. Yeah, I've not seen any. I mean, Cunningham obviously too had his rough edges, but was extremely competent too. So I have not run across any direct mentions that King disliked Cunningham.
Okay, there we are. That's a good one. Easy one to do. Ian Carr, should the US have been distracted by the Aleutian Islands or allow that front to wither by largely ignoring the Japanese? I mean, it's a massive, great rabbit hole, the Aleutians, but have you got a sort of a reasonably quick answer?
I do think it was an irrelevant front, that we should not have cared that they had, staked out Kiska and Attu. I mean, who cares? I've been up in the Aleutians and I've seen what the weather is like up there. Oh my God,
and even penguins don't want to live there. It's pretty shit, don't you?
As I say in Shattered Sword, the Aleutians were suitable for no more offensive activities than the occasional narwhal hunt. It's just a terrible place. So I think we could have completely foregone trying to recapture those islands. Attu was a very, very difficult fight and generated a lot of casualties, but that's easy to say 80 years down the road from purely hindsight, cold and calculated perspective, but this is American territory, okay?
Yeah, well, that's the thing, isn't it?
And wars are emotional beasties. I mean, the American public are like, oh, hell no, you're not going to take that place. So
our Danish view, Aleutians, Falklands, Faroes, all the same. Yeah, that's a very good point. It just comes down to, well, it's ours.
It's ours. Exactly. That's
It
fair.
may be a shithole, but it's our shithole, kind of. Not that I'm saying
Exactly.
folks at the Falklands are a shithole, because it's not. I'm
The,
just talking in general terms.
the
Um,
Argentines have attacked us with their missiles.
oh, I mean, I wasn't. I didn't have Jon Parshall doing a Thatcher impression on my bingo
Your
cards
radar,
today.
but it's true. Yeah. Anyway.
Robert is asking, when does John think the Japanese airfield on Guadalcanal would have been finished and operational? You know, a kind of what if scenario there.
Just a few weeks, really. I mean, when you look at the Marines, they came in, they grabbed some of the Japanese construction equipment, and we had aircraft into that place on, God, August 16th or something like that. So, took us a week or a little bit more. Granted, we're really pretty good at building bases. It's kind of how Americans roll. But the fact that they already had the bulk of the airstrip laid out says to me that this is not a matter of months. This would have been a matter of weeks before the Japanese could potentially have had combat aircraft in there.
Okay, thank you. Jim is asking, why is it that Yamamoto failed to recognize Guadalcanal as the decisive area of action that called for total commitment of the Japanese Navy?
Great question. I think that Yamamoto, smart as he was, is the product of an educational system and a cultural system, and I mean culture in the small sense, in the sense of the Japanese Navy as a military culture. That you've got decades and decades of interwar doctrine, which are all built around this notion of Kante Kessen, right? The decisive battle. What does this puppy look like? And it always, to the Japanese, looked and smelled like a direct blue water clash of main battle lines that was going to be held someplace in the Pacific, Central Pacific. And there's just nothing about Guadalcanal that smells like that. I mean, it's this dingy little, let me stop right there and not insult my friends who live in the Solomon Islands, okay? But grant me too that the climate there is not exactly optimal for modern war making. The logistics are terrible, and just the constricted waters, I think, among other things, really sort of set people on edge in the Japanese Navy. I mean, Iron Bottom Sound is a bathtub, man. A battleship can literally fire a shell from one side of that thing to the other. It is tiny, and when you go there, and you're sailing around in Iron Bottom, and you look at the narrowness of the two channels past Savo Island to come into I mean, it's just like, oh my God, this is not the kind of place that you want to go and fight a fleet action, maybe even not in proximity to it. So, yeah, the Japanese throughout that campaign were always a day late and a dollar short in terms of pushing as many chips into the center of the poker table as they needed to actually win that fight. It took them forever to sort of get their heads around the fact that, my God, the Americans didn't just land a battalion here or a regiment here. They put a whole freaking division down on this island, and they're serious about taking this. Okay, I get, it's not until October that the Japanese are like, okay, we're going to bring down an entire division to try to take this place back from them. So even up to the point when you get into the November naval battles, one of the episodes that just blows me away, there are these two climactic night battles, the Friday the 13th battle, which is disastrous for the Americans. And then 2 days later, you've got Willis Lee doing his decisive shoot on the 14th and 15th. On both of those occasions, the Japanese could have had the services of Kongo and Haruna, which were the sister ships to Kirishima and Hiei, the two battleships that went down there the first night, right? But because they didn't have the Type 3 bombardment ammunition that they felt that they needed to have in order to bombard the airfield effectively, they just left those two battleships in company with the carrier Junyo, basically being her flak escorts. And dudes, I mean, just go along anyway. Just ride shotgun, for crying out loud. Because if the Japanese show up with 4 battleships on that first night, we're screwed. Similarly, they could have brought 3 of them down on the second engagement, even after Hiei had been sunk. When Kondo comes back down that second time to put paid to this operation and runs into Willis Lee, and he's only got Kirishima, he could have had 3 fast battleships versus Washington. It's very difficult to see, in my mind, how Willis Lee prevails against 3 Japanese fast battleships, even if they are older combatants. So, yeah, you see time after time after time that they're just unwilling to make the commitment that they need to win. And I think it's all because Guadalcanal itself just does not look and smell like what a decisive battle should look like.
Very well answered there. And I think from my point of view, the Japanese have almost boxed themselves into a corner. They've expanded their empire really quickly. They've got what they were trying to get, but now they're not quite sure what they want to do with it. I mean, the Axis, from the German point of view, although their plan was shitty and it involved, killing people by their million, they have got a plan of what they're trying to do at this point. Whereas the Japanese have kind of mastered what they wanted. They've got what they wanted, but now, okay, so do we just hold it now? Do we just sit here and then hope that it's so it's weird to look at it that way, but the Germans now, the ideology of the Germans, and I should say the Third Reich, the Nazis, is clear. They want to kill people, they want Lebensraum, they want growth, they want expansion, they want all this. But the Japanese don't really have that. I mean, we're going into a massive, great rabbit hole now.
No, this is a great rabbit hole because I'll make this one last answer, and then let's take another question. One of the things I point out in my book is that the Japanese do not have any sort of discipline when it comes to making strategy. That, okay, you've grabbed this place called Rabaul, which is this big, beautiful base. It's the best piece of real estate in the Southwest Pacific. Yay, you. But then they get into this mode of, well, but Rabaul is getting bombed by bombers that are in Port Moresby. So we need to capture Port Moresby as an outpost of Rabaul to protect Rabaul from attack, which is stupid. Because Port Moresby is completely indefensible and you can never have run supplies down there and blah, 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 blah. There's all sorts of problems with it. But I guarantee you, counterfactual here, let's say the Japanese took Port Moresby during the Battle of Coral Sea. I guarantee you that then they would then have turned around and said, well, we need outpost X in order to protect Port Moresby, right? Yeah. It's just this self-fulfilling, we'll just take whatever is available to hand here. And there really wasn't there was no discipline in what it is that they were trying to do. Some of that goes right back, though, to the fundamental bankruptcy of their strategy coming into this war, that if you can't collapse American morale within the first 6 months or so of this conflict and bring them to the negotiating table, well, what now, bitches?
They've bluffed. They've bluffed, but we haven't fallen for their David Cameron calling for Brexit in the UK. I'm not going to go into politics. Oh shit, they're actually going to go for it. Oh shit, yeah, I thought that was going to shut you up. Well, another question. This is a nice. We talked about the conferences and the meetings, and Sean Ben is saying taking the nationalities out of it. Did the right ideas win in the conferences? And I would say in the 42 area, my opinion is yes, pretty much. Yes, 99%. Yeah. Yeah,
I would agree with that. That one of the things that I point out, and this is Alan Brooks' comment actually later on, is that okay, it had its warts, but the combined chiefs really turn out to be a very effective framework for running a multinational coalition war. And I think that's right. I think in the July conference, we absolutely got the right answer. We're not invading Europe today. We're going to go to...
We don't talk about logistics. We also don't talk about the fact that 1942 is particularly the year of structural reorganization of everything. The Admiralty, the US Navy, the Chiefs of Staff, everything goes through a kind of a process of
U.S. Army too.
Retitling. Just we were calling ourselves this, and now we're calling ourselves that, and that even happens down. We talked about the SAS becoming briefly the small squadron raiding force for a few weeks, then back the SAS again. 42 is that kind of, the same players are starting it as ending it, but the structure has been reorganized because they're still they're beginning the year with that pre-war small military mentality, but
Right.
they're ending the year with we're all going to become massive, great military powers. And I think 42 is the era in which they set themselves up for the size they're going to be by 44, 45. Does that tally with you?
No, I think that's absolutely correct. You know, you look at what Marshall does in remaking the War Department during this year. He walked into that job in 1939, and it's just completely unmanageable. He's got like 158 direct reports or something like that, and they're all of these little satrapies within the army. They got older generals in charge of them, and blah blah blah. It's completely dysfunctional.
Mm.
And he just bides his time. And as soon as the war starts, he kind of has a sketch on the napkin for what it is that he wants the War Department to look like. But now he's got the political clout, and everybody is, you know, the early days of the war, we are flipping out because everything is going so badly everywhere. Then now Marshall recognizes in March that, okay, here's my opening. And, you know, he sends his memo to FDR. This is what I'm going to do. And he's very, very cagey. He doesn't let anybody in the subordinate commands know what's coming. And then, you know, they sign it into law and just boom. There's only 3 commands now in the Army. There's the Army Ground Forces, there's the Army Air Forces, and there's the logistics guys. And that's all there is. And all you other, you know, ordnance clowns and coast defense and whoever the hell else, you don't work for me anymore. You work for one of those 3 guys. Go talk to them. And if you're not on board, you're fired. You know, it's brutal. But to your point, that's absolutely what we have to be doing during this year is just getting in ship shape, rebuilding these organizations so that they are lean and effective and can get decisions made. Yeah. And you look at these, you know, the combined chiefs again, yeah, there was a lot of headbutting and some yelling and an occasional threat of bloodshed. But at the end of the day, yeah, good decisions came out of those conferences.
Yeah, it's in a soccer football analogy. It's like building a stadium suitable for the Premier League, even though you're still 3 leagues down. You're getting the infrastructure in place with the youth academies, everything ready, so that when you're up there, you're not. Oh shit, we're here now. What are we going to do? Which is in a sense what the Japanese have done. The Japanese have kind of, oh shit, we're here now, but we now haven't got the infrastructure to deal with it. Whereas the Allies, we're not there yet, but at least when we get there, we're going to have the infrastructure to carry on, theoretically.
And actually, just to flip over to the Japanese side, just briefly, one of the reasons that they don't have that structure is that the war was very much a pickup affair for them as well. Yeah. When I was growing up as a kid, the common mythology around this war always was that the Japanese had been planning that thing for years, you know, and they'd had years and years to put together these detailed plans for how they were going to attack Malaya and attack the Philippines. That's all BS, man. None of that was in place because as a result of the oil embargo that goes down in July of 1941, really, you know, the Japanese were like, oh God, okay, now what? You know, and it's only then that you start seeing some exercises being conducted at the divisional staff level of like, okay, if I did want to take Hong Kong, how would I actually do that? Mm-hmm. So this means that, yeah, the war from a planning perspective is not only very pick up and fast, but is also strictly oriented towards military accomplishments, which means that when they get in and take over all of these places in Southeast Asia, you know, Java, Malaya, what have you, they have no plan for civil administration other than, oh, I guess we'll just be complete bastards to everybody and, you know, turn them into virtual slaves and make them do the things that they want. But the result of that is that the economies in those necks of the woods are going to absolutely collapse by the end of the war. It's one of the biggest economic collapses in recorded human history. Every economy in that section of the world, other than Thailand, is going to see a more than 50% decrease in economic activity because the Japanese, A, had no plan of how to administer these areas, and B, really didn't give a crap and were bastards about it.
Wow. We've got another big question coming in from David O'Keefe, who's on a bit of a roll with questions. And we've talked
Yes.
about empire. We've talked about, the global stage. And we often talk on the channel about the fact that we look at the war in isolation. We look at the Mediterranean campaign, but we don't talk about the Russian campaign at the same time. So David O'Keefe's question is a bit of a stretch question here. How much is Mackinder's heartland theory playing into American strategic designs when it comes to isolating the Euro-Asian islands? That's the Okay. Well,
Whoosh, baby.
I had to look it up on Wikipedia. I remembered it, but that's that 1904 idea by Mackinder that the heartland of Europe is going from the Aleutians across to the Volga or something, and he who
Wow.
controls that controls everything. So,
This is where I say, that's what you get for talking to a real historian. Okay?
yeah. Well,
As
David's got
opposed to a
he's got the
probe like
letters
me.
after his name and everything. Yeah.
Exactly. And I'm sorry, David. I'm just like, yeah, I'm just, I don't want to say that I'm a one-trick pony. I have a fairly large pony, but it's pretty specifically isolated to this one conflict, and I don't venture further out of it. We can
Well,
talk over
David
lunch.
said we
I'd
can
love
talk
that.
over lunch. An easier one from David is: have you been through the ABC files at NARA, American British Conversations? Great stuff for the period.
No, I have not. That would be great fun, but sadly, no. Yeah, just have not made it out there to do that. I've grabbed a lot of maps from NARA, but
Right.
not those files.
This is going to seem like a trite question compared to what the lofty conversation of earlier, but I think a lot of the basis for the relationship that eventually blooms between America and Britain, you've got to look at FDR and Churchill at the center of that. And I know there's loads and loads of books about Churchill, over 1,000 books, and we talk probably too much about Churchill and too much about FDR. But during
Yeah,
the tricky times, during the King era, and then there's John Curtin in Australia, who's doesn't have a great relationship with the Brits and Churchill.
yeah,
At the bedrock of everything that's happening through 42, 43 is this pretty damn solid friendship between those
yeah.
two there. They disagree at times, but is that is that really important looking back? Is it or are we putting too much importance on that and we're not talking enough about all the staffs below them?
Right. Great question. And in the vein of, what kind of an historian am I? I think I fairly intentionally veer away from sort of the great man view of things. I'm really more of a systems guy. I believe that in order to prosecute a world war effectively, you've got to have great systems.
Yeah.
That said, great systems are often the product of good leadership at the top. But that also said, FDR was not a great organizer. I mean, when you read some of the British comments about how the dude actually ran a meeting, it's just scandalously unorganized. But that played into who FDR was as a politician, in that he liked keeping things opaque, because he was very good at reading a room and understanding what your motivations were, but he never wanted you to know what his motivations were. That's just kind of that's the cat he was. Back to the original question. I do think that FDR and Churchill's relationship cools as the war continues. But I do think that in this phase of the war, 42, yes, that is a really important relationship. And the fact that these two men do get on at a personal level, I think that one of the critical moments during that relationship happens in June of 42, when Churchill is over and visiting, and he's literally sitting in the Oval Office when the word comes in on a pink slip of paper that Tobruk has just fallen. And again, on the backs of just all of the numbing litany of British humiliation and defeat during the first 6 months of this war, to now be sitting in the office of the most powerful country in the world and feeling like a supplicant, right? Because Tobruk has just been yanked out from underneath you, and it's humiliating and embarrassing. And the first words out of FDR's mouth were, "How can we help?" Okay. And Allenbrook remarks on that directly and says, It was completely unexpected, and it was, very gratefully received on our part because he knew what an emotionally fraught moment this was for us. I mean, that's the subtext there, and he didn't take advantage of it.
Mm.
That FDR's first reaction really was to say, "What can we do for you guys?" And very quickly, one of the things that we end up doing is we're going to send a ton of Shermans and some self-propelled 105s over to Eighth Army. Initially, it was thought that, okay, maybe we'll end up sending First Armored Division over there too, but then there's all sorts of problems like, we don't really want an American division to, be under British control. It kind of muddies the waters. This needs to be a British victory, among other things. And the British, too, were just like, no, we don't want American troops. Commonwealth troops, great, but nah, not so much the Americans. But send us their tanks. That'd be awesome.
Mm.
To the extent that not only did we send all of those tanks, but one of the ships that was carrying 60 of those tanks got sunk. And without even telling the British that he had done this, Marshall turned around, put another 60 Shermans on another ship, and just sent it on its way. And we're desperate for armor at this point. But I think that gives you a sense for the fact that there was goodwill between Churchill and FDR at that level to a certain extent that meant that there had to be goodwill at the staff levels as well, that it was being modeled by the two
I
supreme
think
commanders.
it sort of influences things in a kind of a
Right.
behind the scenes kind of way. And when you said that, FDR said, "How can we help?" That's when you read anything about even modern relationships, husbands and wives, or people that are fraught, is that when someone's at their lowest ebb, almost the best thing you can do as a partner is say, "What can I do to help?" By just
Yeah.
listening. And I think that. Yeah, we can overplay the Churchill thing and the FDR thing, and because it means that all these minions, all these fantastically qualified thousands of members of staff that are shuffling papers, typing up reports, passing things on, that are in communication all the time, their work is being overlooked. But if you've got a solid relationship, I had this discussion with I think whoever it was Mike Nyberg when we were talking about Operation Torch, and he's very much the opinion that when the relationships were strained, that central good relationship between them was there. Although he had the comment stroke question, the fun thing about that relationship was who was playing who. Did Churchill drag FDR into the war? Did FDR use the Brits to delay it as long as possible? And you do get that a little bit in who's the organ grinder, who's the monkey sometimes
Yeah,
in
who's the
that
puppet
relationship.
master there? That's a good. I don't look at Churchill dragging FDR into the war. I'm like, the Japanese dragged us into the war,
Yeah,
and then
good point.
very fortuitously for us, Hitler and Mussolini turned around on the 11th of December and said, "We're in too," which, talk about a political gift for FDR. The guy has just wangled a declaration of war against the Japanese, but he understands, and all of our military bigwigs understand, that somehow we've got to gerrymander this into
Yeah.
a declaration of war against the Germans. Those are the guys we really need to start going after here. How do we make that happen? Oh, thanks, Adolf. Took that off our plate. Right on.
Yeah.
There's something else I was going to say about Joyner. Um, you can't underplay Eisenhower's role in that goodwill building as well.
Mm.
In that, when we get into the planning for Torch and when he is setting up his staff organization, that dude is a zealot about we are operating jointly, and tells and illustrates to his staff officers, if any of you are not with this program and are going to bring in national biases here, I will fire you and send you
I
home.
know.
And he does. Okay, he's to the point that people like Patton are like, "Oh my God, he's just another limey like they are."
Yeah.
He hates that kind of stuff. But I give Eisenhower tremendous credit. He was not that effective a field commander, obviously, in 1942. And that's really not what he's supposed to be doing when you get down to it. He's got to run the political machinations to make this alliance work. And it's to his credit that he gets, guys like Cunningham, for instance, who
Yeah.
a pretty crusty sea dog, you know, and Cunningham is like, no, I like Eisenhower, and we were honored to work with him because it's just absolutely clear from the get-go that Eisenhower is going to play it right down the middle, even with everybody, be completely honest, and just try to make this thing work. And leading by example in that way, he ends up with ultimately an extremely effective organization.
And we're back to that same concept of the North African Mediterranean in terms of the Army and the Navy and the Air Force learning their trade, is that Eisenhower also learned his trade there.
For sure.
That comes into play later when he's the really top dog for Overlord, but without being out in the Mediterranean, just learning those. I mean, obviously he had those skills inherently. The guy was brilliant as a diplomat in that regard, but he's still going to go out there and actually practically learn how to deal with the Brits and Vichy France and Arabic peoples and all the other people he had to deal with out there.
What
in a
a
sense, you can
nightmare.
argue that after Torch, it got easier because at least for Overlord, you're kind of all starting in one place and everybody's in kind of Britain, and there aren't too many completely obscure factions involved. And I'm saying not the North African factions in Vichy were complicated, but
like Darlan and, you know, all those.
Exactly.
Darlan and Girard and, oh, Jesus, what a mess.
Let's go back to a couple of specific kind of Pacific 42 questions to kind of round things off. And so, Kevin was asking, going back to Yamamoto again, why was Yamamoto given so much autonomy even after the defeat of Midway? Or you kind of half answered that about his Guadalcanal strategy, but has he just reached a point of untouchable?
Yeah, kind of. And some of that is due to the fact that, understand the Japanese had never admitted publicly, at least to this point, that Midway was a defeat, right? When you've got the Emperor of Japan issuing an official imperial rescript commemorating the great victory at the Battle of Midway, and then, you know, kind of off the record saying, oh yeah, by the way, we lost a carrier there and another one was damaged. You know, nobody's talking about that. So yeah, Yamamoto's a rock star. And it would have been a real loss of face, I think, for a lot of people, for him to be canned. But Kevin, that's a fascinating question, because one of the things that you don't see coming out of Midway is a lot of introspection on the part of the Japanese as to why the hell did this just happen, you know? And do we have the right commanders in the right spots? But yeah, nobody's head rolls. Yamamoto's doesn't. His right-hand man, Ugaki, doesn't. You still got Nagumo in charge of the carrier force, because again, if we're promulgating this and what do I want to say, promoting it as a victory, I can't really get rid of those commanders. So there you have it.
That's another fantastic kind of philosophical discussion about at what point do you allow heads to roll? Because you look at all the commanders in World War II, how many of them on any side got it right every single time? I'm thinking from von Manstein to Rommel to Montgomery to MacArthur. If you can only make one fuck up and you're gone, then some of the best commanders of World War II don't end up being the best commanders of World War II. But likewise, if you keep on letting them do stuff after multiple, we're back to sport again. At what point do you sack the coach?
Right.
How many is a run of bad? What's just bad form that's going to be turned around, and what is you're not going to get yourself out of that? And I think that you see that in Normandy, for example. The Americans may be a bit too quick to remove commanders. The British may be a little bit too slow to remove commanders.
And I think some of that also, the higher up you are in some cases, the more leniency you're given. And I'm just going to turn it right around to one of my favorite punching bags, Douglas MacArthur. Because, okay, if you look big picture throughout the war as a whole, and then actually extend that to post-war occupation of Japan, I absolutely want to give Douglas MacArthur props for having learned a great deal in 43 and 44. And I think he was a tremendous administrator of post-war Japan. He gave them a very enlightened constitution, and he was absolutely critical in making sure that the Japanese people did not starve during the winter of 45, 46. Good on you, Douglas. Your generalship in the 13 months of the book that I cover, though, from December 41 to December 42, were awful. Awful. And by any rational measure, the fact that you got out of the Philippines with an unearned Medal of Honor after having
Yeah,
done
yeah.
nothing and absolutely botched the defense of Lingayen Gulf. And then you go down to New Guinea and you botch that campaign
Do it
too.
again. Yeah, yeah,
I don't know
yeah.
what it, but again, wars are not a rational business, and the American people needed a hero, and Douglas MacArthur would have made millions as an ad man on, in New York City. And so his press releases were just works of
Yeah.
beauty, complete lies. But they fed the American people the hero mythos that they needed in this dark point in the war. Americans needed a hero, and Douglas MacArthur was determined that I'm going to be that guy.
Well, that's
And
one
it
of the
worked.
fascinating things about 1942 is that 1942 is probably the peak era of really important events psychologically, propaganda-wise, that have no actual impact on the out of the war. Or, Doolittle raid. I'm looking at you, and
Right.
there are lots of the British paras into the aqueduct in Italy and those kind of things. You go, okay, that they have literally no kind of result at
Well,
all, but they're kind of foundational.
right.
They're feeding the press with some good news, and you see that little bit going into 43, but 44, the good news is all actually good on the battlefield news as well, isn't it?
Right.
But 42, there's
Right.
this weird kind of it can be important just for the morale of the Rosie the Riveter. And then that obviously is going to be part of your 42 book, isn't it?
Yeah, Doolittle is humongously important from American home front morale
Yeah,
standpoint,
exactly.
to demonstrate that this ain't over, bitches. You may think you've got us down, but here's a thumb in your eye, and we're going to keep coming. And its effects on the Japanese side were profound.
Yeah.
In that, now the Japanese army, which to this point had been very, very aloof regarding the Yamamoto Midway plan, all of a sudden does a complete 180, and they're like, yeah, I guess you're right that we really won't be secure until we get rid of those pesky American carriers. And yeah, you know how we had told you we weren't going to kick in any troops to invade that place called Midway? Well, here's a regiment. And by the way, we're also cutting orders to 2 of our divisions to start amphibious training for an invasion of Oahu. So that's that's a game changer. Yeah.
I mean, it's why by 1944, we were
Good
talking a
point,
lot
Colin.
about 44 earlier in the year on World War II TV. It's all about liberating people, gaining territory, and destroying Axis troops. But 42, you can measure success in a whole lot more different ways. There's the propaganda in that. There's the as we talked about earlier. There's the learning how to do shit. Just learning curve at 42.
Yeah.
So writing about 42, bringing it back to the book in a kind of another shameless plug, that must be one of the things you're really trying to do is measuring that something can have little impact or little apparent impact at the immediate conclusion of the battle, but has this strange kind of
knock-on
momentum
effect.
beginning thing that you go, and it's like, oh, I see what that now brought a year later, because the meeting happened that began that started that got that guy there that did that. And there must be a lot of that kind of concept in 42 is but we don't, it's like putting in a trilogy of films, it's like putting something in the first film that the payoff's going to come in the third film. You go, I see why they did that now. Yeah,
right. That is absolutely right. So turning to the Eastern Front, in one of the earlier chapters, I think around April, I do this throughout the book. I mean, it is primarily a narrative military history, what happened each month during the war. But being who I am, I'm of course always taking these little thematic dive downs, because there's lots of stuff going on under the hood. It's not like the Russians just rolled out of bed one morning in November of 1942 and were like, we're not getting our butts kicked by those guys anymore. Man, there's a lot of stuff going on in the Red Army from a doctrinal and reorganization sense. We tend to look at the Soviet Union and the Red Army in particular as this sort of wooden, unresponsive, lethargic beast. And I'm here to tell you that if you look at what they did to their army, starting as early as July of 41, man, they tear its org chart down not once but twice.
Yep.
And you're fighting this fighting retreat against the most ferocious army on the planet. I mean, it's hair-raisingly dangerous and risky, but they knew that they had to put these military reforms into place or they're just not going to be able to play the game. So what you witness is, they started with these enormous mechanized corps that had hundreds and hundreds of tanks, and they're completely unwieldy, and they just all get trashed during the early days of Barbarossa. And so like, okay, well, shit, we'll tear all this down, and they get rid of tank divisions completely, and they break it all down into brigades. And so they're doling out these, little penny packet brigades to various rifle divisions and whatnot. But then they sort of notice that these things just don't have the sort of resiliency and built-in organic support services and that sort of thing to really have the staying power in the field that a proper panzer division has. What do we do now? And so what you see happening in 42 is a beginning of a building up again towards the fielding of first tank corps and then mechanized corps that really are more near peer equivalents to a German panzer division. They got to figure out how to maneuver them. They got, what's our doctrine? You sort of see a resurrection of deep battle as this year goes on. So, when I go through this sort of exposition in April, and I come out the end of it, and I'm like, why the long discourse on how many more PPSH machine pistols were in an average rifle battalion versus, in 41 versus 42? Why this long digression? Because all of these things are going to pay benefits down the road in a few months, but it's not going to be immediately apparent now, because now, guess what? We're going to go through the catastrophes on the Kerch Peninsula and at Kharkov, and to outward appearances, the Red Army is still the same inept, stupid animal that it was, but there's a lot of stuff going on underneath. Hold that thought. When we get to, October, November, we're going to have a completely different animal. That is sort of how I approach the book just in general, that we have to understand this under the hood kind of stuff.
Yeah, well,
and this actually understand.
This is why we're all a bit burdened by the turning points of history that we all have to end up using, because they bring people in and they're easy to kind of put a label on it. But actually, I'm not really a fan of the turning point thing. But yes, Midway is a turning point. Yes, El Alamein is a turning point. But actually, it's a lazy way of describing what is actually a slow, as you say, under the hood development
kind of thing.
That is very hard to pinpoint in a tweet, isn't it? You cut an article, looks good. No, YouTube show, the turning point of 1942 sounds really good, but a more incremental, gradual thing that over the course of 15 to 18 months, divisions gradually started to be more officers with this coming through there, and they started going from this level of armor to this level of armor. That does it. People go,
right. Yeah. Okay, so let me you've actually set me up beautifully to plug yet again. Thank you.
Yeah,
one of the things I talk about in the introduction to this book is that no, I don't believe that there was a single turning point during this year. And instead, what I trot out is a series of a couple of dozen what I call fundamental questions, key questions, 3 or 4 per combatant that have to be answered in some fashion this year. Can the Germans get the oil that they need to prosecute a longer term war?
Yeah.
That's one. Can the Red Army be reformed into the sort of fighting organization that can at least go toe-to-toe with the Wehrmacht in a battle of maneuver and hold its own? That's another. Can we manage to not have the wheels fall off the Soviet economy? That's a biggie. So I say that 42 is this year where there's an accumulation of big questions that have to be answered, and a lot of them are going to be answered positively or negatively in some fashion or other. But what ends up happening as a result of the Allies answering more of those questions in the affirmative or in the positive for themselves is that this huge man of war now at the end of this year has slowly lurched onto a new course it's on a different trajectory, and it's a result of a lot of those little things.
And I think that is a perfect way to bring things to an end. Although
There
people
we
will be
go.
annoyed, we're going to stop this. We can always pick the conversation up later on. And just to quote David O'Keefe again there, who's getting a lot of favoritism, maybe it's better we call them tipping points as opposed to turning points. And, you know,
Inflection points. Yeah. Yeah.
But it is convenient in terms of writing a book that so much of this stuff did happen over that winter. You know, El Alamein, Torch, it's all sort of November. Then you see Stalingrad is, okay, you're nudging into 43, but it does sort of have that calendar year chapter break.
It does. It breaks very nicely, actually. I mean, yes, to an extent, you can say Guadalcanal is not going to be over until Feb of 43. Battle of the Atlantic isn't really going to be decided until April of 43. Stalingrad, as you say, also goes into Feb of 43. But I would say that I'm not going to talk about Battle of the Atlantic. It's clear to me that with the victory at the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal on the 15th of November, Willis Lee has decided that campaign in the Americans' favor. Likewise, I would say on the Eastern Front, that it really isn't till Second Guards Army drops the hammer on Manstein and puts paid to his Operation Wintergewitter, which is the intended relief of Stalingrad. You know, understand, up until this point in the war, whenever the Germans have been able to put in a set piece counterattack, they usually get their way, right?
Yeah.
Manstein gets crushed by Second Guards Army, and that, I think, that really guarantees now that Stalingrad is toast and we're in a different war.
Oh, well, we can do a whole conversation in the future about the relief attempts, because it's often that it's not that the Germans are defeated in the battles, but often they compound it by their attempt to double down and try. So the Stalingrad relief, I'm thinking about the relief of Budapest and things like that. Conrad in 44, 45. It's like, no, you've fucking lost now. What are you doing?
Right. Yeah, what are you doing?
Time now to pull back. Time now to think about doing something else. But no, let's keep on doubling down and sending more people in. But
yeah. Oh, wow.
We will leave things there. But folks, if you haven't already, the link to Jon's 1942 book website is in the description below. But I will leave you all wanting more, as it's the best way to do it. And we'll just bring back Jon some point. We'll do a Christmas show or something and just carry on the conversations that we didn't do last time. But as always, it's fantastic talking to you. I love it when I'm having a show where I've kind of got a smile on my face the whole time, even though we're talking about war, which is a destructive, deadly, awful thing. We can still 80 years on have a bit of fun talking about it. So thank you, Jon. Thank you, everybody, for your fantastic questions. I will see you all after my sojourn to Poland and Germany. Cheers, everybody. Bye.